Hello and welcome back. It is part 2 of painting Kragnos. In part 1, there's a link up there in the corner or in the description. We did the bronze of the shield. Since then, I've done all the rest of the bronze on this model. Because of the way he goes together, I actually had to do the trim first, which is not the way I like to do things. This time, we're going to do the lower body on this one. Because he's such a big model, I need to break it up into several sections for you. The base we're going with is XV88, which I'm currently decanting into my new plastic squeezy bottles. The glass ones unfortunately ended up being problematic with the lids. And just using a middling sized brush, just apply it wherever we need this to be. And that's going to be the vast majority of the lower body. It is a bit awkward working around the trim, because the way this one goes together, I couldn't really see a very straightforward way of doing the trim separately, and I also couldn't really do the body and then the trim afterwards because I'm doing dry brushing and I didn't want to have to repaint the body. So it's a little bit fiddly, but if you take your time, it's okay, you can get around there. You can see I'm leaving the hooves and the fetlocks in the white primer, and I haven't used a zenithal shade, I haven't used a grey or black primer. I always work from a white primer when I'm doing any sort of non-black colours, and that's just how I do things, it's how I've always done things. There's a lot of surface area to cover here and it's very, very fiddly. These newer models, they're not as fun to paint, I will be honest. They are tricky to get your brush in everywhere because I'm pretty sure these are done digitally. I don't think they're sculpted physically anymore like they used to be. And as a result, it's almost like they're made with no consideration for the fact you've got to get a tool into the gaps around all the fiddly bits. Added to that, this guy is quite spiky, so he's not the most comfortable thing to hold on to. The one thing I am grateful for though is he's not metal. In the olden days, a model like this would have had to be made out of metal and it would have been ludicrously heavy, so I'm glad that we don't have that problem here. Not to mention his self-destructive tendencies, since the metal models found it very difficult to hold themselves together, even if you pinned them. But as you can see, the base coat is coming together nicely. The camera's having less of a hard time actually seeing the details. It isn't keen on the pure white, and we're now going to move over to Rhinox hide. I'm using this for all of the fetlocks and the hooves. Now I'm not painting the end of the tail and I'm not painting his mane, which will also be in this colour later on, because they're areas that I'm actually holding on to the model to paint other parts. So as long as I remember what I've used, which is a lot easier since I'm recording it, that's easy enough to go back to later and sort out. I'm not trying to blend here, I'm just using cues on the sculpt itself to tell me where to change from one colour to the next. And here we are, all the bronze done and the base coats on the lower body. These are the sections that we're going to be painting in this video. Now it's time to apply some wash. I'm going with Seraphim Sepia because I want this sort of brown. I don't know what colour you would call it beyond that. I don't want it to be too dark. I want it to be a paler colour because I want it to contrast with things I'm going to be doing later on this model. Being fairly liberal with the wash, I'm just being careful around the bronze detailing and just letting the wash do its work. You could probably do this with a contrast paint if you wanted to, but because of the way that I like to paint, this is how I'm going to do it. And you can see how quickly it pulls out all of those details in the sculpt that weren't really as visible before. There's a lot of very interesting skin folds and little veins. The musculature on this is actually done quite nicely. It's proper high fantasy stuff, which is a lot of fun. Once I'm happy with that, I'm going to use some good old-fashioned Nuln oil. I'm not waiting for that soya from sepia to dry. It doesn't matter if that blends into the Nuln Oil because of the way that I'm doing things. Being very careful around the bronze trim here on the leg. It's quite a tricky one to get in at on that one. It's another example of details where it doesn't feel like there was a lot of consideration for the brush or the tool that you're going to be using, so a bit fiddly. But that's where your washes have a big benefit. They will find all of the spaces you need them to go into. Just take my time, again being fairly liberal with this wash and just getting it all over those dark brown areas until everything is all covered. Last thing to do was actually put it back on the base so that the wash can run down and look more natural, and then leave it to dry overnight. Basically, there was so much surface area and so much wash. Now here he is after he's dried, and that gives us our basis for doing the next stage. Back to XV88, which is that base colour we started with. I'm watering this down just a little bit, so I've got some on my palette, I've applied a little bit of water, and I'm just going roughly over the high points. I'm not trying to blend this in too much, and I'm not trying to give a blanket coverage. I'm using a combination of some light stippling and some ordinary brush strokes just to bring the colour up to about where I want it. I'm also leaving some areas completely untouched by this coat of paint because they will be in shadow. But you can see as I work along how it's pulling out those finer details on this sculpt. And you can go a very long way with this. You can actually go kind of crazy with how much you highlight it or not. This is one of the more enjoyable parts of the process because you're sort of bringing things back into focus, and it gives you a very quick result for fairly little effort. You want to be fairly light touch with the brush, and just it's better to apply less paint and go over it multiple times than try and hit it all in one go. So you'll see me occasionally going back over an area that looks like I've already done. That's what that's about. There is a big cut sculpted into that leg. That's not something that I've done as a mistake. That's actually part of the sculpture. After that, we're going to do some Scrag Brown because this is looking a little bit more desaturated than I'd like. I'm not watering this down, and I'm just applying it where I think the colour needs warming up a bit. It's a little bit tricky to explain that one. And then I'm going to add a little bit of Screaming Skull, no more than 25%, and I'm going to start going over areas where I want things to be paler. Like I want his belly to be quite a bit paler than the rest of his body on this section. And I'm picking out the high points as the light would fall on it to some degree. So I'm avoiding the recessed areas around the bronze trim, and I'm avoiding going underneath the model except for where I want that very pale fur to end up being. So you can see there I'm filling in the belly a lot more than I'm doing on the legs. I keep going back to the palette and I'm adding a little bit of water for the larger areas because that makes it a bit easier to blend those colours in. And once I'm happy with this stage, I add a little bit more Screaming Skull to that Scrag Brown and do some smaller highlights. Doing a bit more stippling on this section here, and I want it to be a much sharper highlight. sort of, if you've ever seen Frank Zappa high fantasy artwork, it's sort of that approach. I want something a little bit more dramatic, a little bit more unrealistic as well, to be fair, with the lighting. And it just emphasises the details of the sculpture. I'm a little bit pickier about where I put this, but again, very light touch, because I don't want to overdo it at this stage, and it's easier to add more than take it away. You can see how the colour's changing, and then on the back, on the very large sections there, I apply it to the edges and then sort of blend it out and stipple it until I get roughly the look I want. A little bit more of the Screaming Skull to make it paler again, so that we can make this belly lighter than the rest of the body. And now with pure Screaming Skull, I can do the very sharp highlights on the body. And this is where the light would catch it as the model is stood on its base at the highest points. As it's speeded up, you can actually see it happening on the miniature. You can see what I'm doing a lot better than if I played this at real time speed. You can very clearly see how it builds up and which areas I'm leaving dark and I'm not adding this very high highlight to. Just for doing this scar on the back there, just use the edge of the tip of the brush, because I just want to catch the very tips of everything. And then for the rest of the bulk, I start at an edge where I want the light to be, and then just sort of blend it back out into the darker area. If it's too much, I can always add a bit of water on the brush and blend it out. Going back over the belly with the pure Screaming Skull again, just to make it a lot paler. If you've ever seen wild horses, you'll know the colouring I'm going for. Now we've got some Doomball brown. This is a very red brown, and I'm using this to shade around areas where I think it looks a bit washed out. So I want to put some saturation back into some of the shadows and to give some warmth to it, as though this is more of a sort of living flesh showing through fur kind of a look. That's why I've not gone for a very smooth blend as well. I want it to be slightly blotchy, as you would expect from fur on a wild animal. Back to Scrag Brown again. There's a lot of this back and forth with your colours, and here I'm using the Scrag Brown as a glaze. So it's quite thin, and I'm just sort of toning down some of those very pale highlights. Kislev Flesh, quite a peachy colour this one. And again, this is all about tweaking colours here and there. Mostly I'm going after anywhere there are veins moulded in, or the scars, anywhere the fur would be likely to be quite thin and the skin underneath would be showing through, because I imagine you would get more of this sort of warm peachy tone. It's very subtle, but it stops the whole thing looking sort of blank and uniform. It gives some variety to the tones that you've got here. This scar on the back was quite tricky to do. The way it's sculpted, it's quite a shallow sculpt and very detailed. Rhinox hide is where we're off to next, and this is for the deepest shadows. I wanted a little bit more distinction between the fur and the bronze elements, so I'm very carefully just going in and blending it out from those very deep points, catching a few of the deep recesses of the muscles as well, and it just helps give a little bit more depth to everything, a little bit more drama. And to make sure that my lighting is roughly where I want it to be, I've put him back on his base. Now, I did make a mistake when I was recording this, because I didn't realise that although I could see perfectly well what I was doing, the camera couldn't, because the model was in the way. But I'll show you what I can. And what I'm doing here is I'm picking up from those colours I've already used and tweaking the tones to match what shades and highlights I want. And you can see how much depth there is there now compared to where we started. And you've got all these different sort of reds and creams and browns to give this sort of wild horse tone to him. back to Rhinox hide for our next bit, which is adding some stripes. I know this is a very detailed model, but from the off I saw some wild horses and mustangs and that sort of thing, and they had these sort of brown zebra stripes, particularly on buckskin, and it just felt like the right choice for this model. I don't need to shade or highlight this. I've thinned the paint a little bit, so it's a little bit transparent, and what's underneath shows through, and it's such a small detail you don't need to go crazy with your extra shading and highlighting on that particular aspect. Just keeping it to the hind legs, the tail, and just the top of his bum there. Evil Sunz Scarlet. And this one might be a bit of a surprise because I'm just using this to highlight all of the Rhinox hide that we've applied to the fetlocks. I want to lean into the high fantasy thing, and I thought the best way to do that was add an unexpected colour. So I'm adding this to the Rhinox hide to give him a very red tone on all of the long hair. It's not something people do so much these days because it's not in vogue, is it, this sort of thing? But it's very simple. You just load your brush, use the edge of it, and build up your layers gradually along each section. Now, one thing with these new sculpts is they do make this very easy to do. They're very sharp on these sorts of details, and you can very easily build it up. It's a lot harder to do this on the old metal ones. As a final highlight on that, we're going to use Kislev Flesh. This keeps the red in that sort of brown tone, so it doesn't go orange, it doesn't go pink, it stays within this sort of brownish palette that we've got going on for the rest of the body, and it also brings it sort of in line with the paler fur that we've done on the body as well, since we've already used that brown on there as part of building up our colours. I'm also using it to highlight the spiky bits, the hooves, all of the little horns everywhere all over his body, and there's loads of them. I'm doing it very roughly because this part of the model is quite rough. It's like a really bad fingernail kind of a look. And then as a final highlight on that, we'll use some Screaming Skull again. It's a really versatile colour, this. It just works for so many things. I'm not being particularly careful. I'm not looking for beautiful blends here. I actually want quite a rough and ready look to this, and that's exactly what I'm getting. I'm just sticking to the areas that are really quite high up where the light's going to catch it. I'm not going all the way around the spikes. And I'm being very careful not to get this on any of the previous details we've done, which is easier said than done with some of those spikes. For the hooves, I drag the side of the brush up from the bottom, almost like dry brushing, but I'm not using a dry brush, I'm using the side of a regular brush for that. And here we are. This is all of that work just blitzed through, several hours worth of it, and that's the bottom half of the body done, apart from his tail, obviously. Please do have a look in the description. There's more links to various ways you can support the channel, and of course there is a wealth of other content on the channel here. I'll be doing more on Kragnos soon. I shan't leave it as long between this and the next instalment. Thanks for watching, and I shall see you again in the next one.